Today we're going to look at something that I think is so crucial in our lives and a question that we got to ask, and we're going to do it here for a moment. Now, today, with it being a special day with all of the kids in here, I think that this is something even they can get, because this is one of those classic Bible stories again, okay? We always talk about how there's those Bible stories that you hear, and, you know, it's the one you tell your kids, and you remember growing up. Everybody knows these stories. So let me ask all of the kids a question real quick. Okay, how many of you kids know the story of Daniel and the lion's den? All right, who can tell me real quick what happens? You got thrown in the den of the lions. Why? He was worshiping God. Leave it to the preacher kid, right? Thanks, Bubba. Go ahead, sit down. Now, here's the thing. We've all heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den. If you're brand new to church, you've never really been in church before, and you don't know that story, it's a great story. Go and read it. It's in Daniel chapter 6, and that's what we're going to look at. But now, for all of us older people who have read the story a bunch of times, how many of you know that when you go back and you read some of those old Bible stories, it's very easy for us, like when we're reading and stuff, and I catch myself doing it, it's so bad, okay? Don't tell Jesus, he'd be mad at me. But I find myself reading through, and if I come to a story I know, I'm like, I know that story. I don't really need to read it again because I know the story, right? I know what happens to Daniel in the story of Daniel in the lion's den. You know, Daniel he's a good guy, these other guys don't like him, so as a result, they try to find some way for him to get in trouble. They make the king do something, make a law, and Daniel ends up thrown in the lion's den, but he doesn't get eaten. It's a great story. And sometimes we have a tendency to skip it. We kind of just gloss over a little bit on some of these because we sit here and we go, it's such a basic story. If you grew up in church, you have heard this story your entire life. But I discovered something as I was reading this story, something that was so profound that it made me just stop. Like, do you have those moments where you're reading the Bible and it's something that you've read a million times and you're reading it again and all of a sudden you just stop and you're like, I never noticed that. It's so cool when that happens, right? I love it when that, and that happened today. And so today we're going to ask a question. We're going to ask the question. Oh, it's not going to work. I turned it off. Here we go. Maybe. How do we live faithfully? Out of all the people in the Bible that you hear about and you read about and you go, who would you say lived faithfully in difficult circumstances? Job, yeah. But we would also sit there and we would say, Daniel, taken from his homeland at a young age, put in this new situation with a new king, new gods, all that, and yet he remains faithful throughout. Now, in the past couple of weeks, we've heard about Nebuchadnezzar being the king. Nebuchadnezzar at this point in the story is gone. He has died, he's passed away, and now there have been several other kings, and now we come to a point where there's a guy by the name of Darius who becomes king. So we're going to look and see a little bit at this. And there was a verse, and we're going to start with the verse that just shocked me, okay? This is the verse that just completely caught me off guard. Okay, in the whole thing, and it was this verse right here in Daniel chapter 6, verse 5. These are guys who were trying to find a way to get rid of Daniel. These guys did not like Daniel. And this is what they say. We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Now, think about that. I just had to stop, okay? Because then the question came out to me of how many of us could honestly sit there and say that our enemy, the person who dislikes you who dislikes you the most in this world, the person who would laugh if you were to just fall apart, if that person were to say, we're not going to find any fault with them unless it has to do with their God. And I began looking at my own life and going, holy cow. How many other areas can an enemy of mine sit there and go, no, here's problems, here's this, here's that, there's this that's wrong with him, there's that. He loses his temper, he's got a problem here, He doesn't keep his office clean. Whatever. Any number of things that people could come up and say that is wrong with me, and yet the guys who are the most against Daniel sit there and say, we're not going to find anything unless it's about his God. Now, that's like, for your enemy to say that about you, that's like the biggest compliment ever, right? It's like the people who are searching for what's wrong with you can't find anything, and they know if they're going to find something, it has to be in your faith. That's huge. So I began sitting there going, okay, well, what does it look like to live a faithful life? What is it that Daniel did? How was he faithful in his life? And I believe he was faithful in 3 areas, okay? He was faithful in a lot of areas, but there were 3 main areas. That's what we're going to look at. And this can apply to everyone. So all of the kids, you guys can relate to this in a lot of ways. But this applies to everyone. So how do we live a faithful life? That's the question. The first thing we're going to look at is being faithful at work. Being faithful at the things you do. Now, for some of you kids, you're like, well, I don't have a job yet, so it doesn't matter. No, you do. It's called school. And one of these days, that school will turn into a job where you actually get paid. Right now, it's just school. It's learning. It's doing all of those things. But for us adults, going to work, you know what your job is. Okay? You know what you're there for. You know what it is that you do. Now, if you're a stay-at-home mom or something and you don't go to work and you're like, I'm off the hook. No, you're not. You've got a job and you know that just as well as anybody. You know, and you've got a tougher job than a lot of people. So be thinking of this work. It's not just what you go and get paid for. It's the thing in life that you're supposed to do. And let's look at how Daniel does this. How is Daniel faithful? How do we know that he's faithful? So again, we're in Daniel chapter 6. We're going to look at verse 1 through 3. It pleased Darius, who was the king, to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps would give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all of the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Okay? So right away at the very beginning, we see how this King Darius comes into power and he sets about how he's going to organize things. So he's got these guys that he places over the kingdom in different areas, different ways. And over them he's got 3 guys that they all report to. That way he's not going to miss anything. Okay? And he does this, and Daniel's one of them. But Daniel is so good at his job. He's got such a good spirit about him. He works well with everybody. He keeps tabs on everybody. He's diligent at his work. He does all of this stuff that Darius sits there and looking at him goes, I'm going to put him over the entire kingdom. Like, I don't even need to run anything if Daniel's over it, because Daniel's got it all under control. Daniel was faithful at his job. Now, think about it. Okay? If Daniel was lazy at work, would the king have said that about him? No. If Daniel's integrity was questioned in other ways, would the king have said that about him? No. If Daniel was trying to cheat, trying to, connive his way out of doing things, was sloppy with work, was lazy in any way, was a procrastinator, was a dictator, was any of those things that you could be at your job, if he was doing any of the things that would cause things to not go so well, would Darius have been willing to give him control over the entire kingdom? And the answer is very simple. No. It wouldn't have happened. Okay? Daniel was faithful in his work. He was faithful in the things he was doing. Now, why is that? Why would Daniel do that? Because Daniel, and we've seen in other passages throughout Scripture where Daniel's not one to sit there and try to make his name big or try to get more, accolades or trying to get any. He's not trying to do that. But he's trying to do things faithfully. There's a passage in Colossians I want us to look at. This passage captures me a lot of times. Okay? So this is the passage, Colossians chapter 3. Now, kids, I want you guys to say this passage with me real quick, okay? So repeat it right after me. Say, whatever you do, work heartily Do you guys know what that means? No. Work hard. So let's say that. Say, work hard. As for the Lord and not for men. Now what does that mean? Anybody know? Okay. Somebody else. Anybody else want to give it a shot? What does it mean? No? I guess he did a good job at explaining it, right? What does it mean? Do everything you do as if you're doing it to God. Now, I don't know about you, but like that gets me in a bad way. Okay? It's like those days where it snows a lot and I've got to go and shovel my driveway and then come over to the church and sometimes do that, or I've got to do whatever, and you're doing a job that you don't really like, you know. It's that day your boss makes you clean toilets. I get so mad when my boss at the coffee shop makes me clean toilets. She doesn't do it very often, so when she does, it's bad, you know. If she's like, Chris, I need you to clean toilets today, I'm just in a bad mood all day, right? And I've got to stop and I've got to think about it, and I've got to be like, do everything I do as if I'm doing it for God. Dadgummit, you know. If Jesus asked me to clean toilets, I'd clean toilets and I'd be happy about it. Yes, Jesus, anything. But I've got a bad attitude because I'm sitting here, you know, and I've got this to do. I don't want to do it, and I just get this, you know. And don't look at me like you don't do it too. You all do it too, and you know it's true. We get these moments where we have bad attitudes, but what we're saying is do everything you do as if you're doing it for God and not for men. Now, that again changes things, because all of a sudden now it's all about my attitude, right? Because if you're grumbling about your work, you can do that when your boss isn't around, right? Right? Boss isn't there to hear it. You can say and think whatever you want, and they will never find out. All the bad opinions you got of your boss, how incompetent they may or may not be, any of those things are coming to your mind because they're making you do something you don't want to do. And then all of a sudden you've got to stop. If you're doing everything for the Lord, you sit there and go, oh, He knows what I'm thinking. He knows the thoughts. Like, He hears them. And how many of you sit there when you think about that, you go, that's kind of embarrassing, you know? Like all that bad stuff I just thought in my head, Jesus heard. And it makes us evaluate our attitude. Not only that, it makes us evaluate the quality of our work. It is very, very easy to go cheap on something, right? Or to not do it to the best of your ability. Or to just get it just good enough so that not everybody will notice that it's not of the best quality. But the thing is Jesus sees that. God sees that. And if we're doing everything as if we're doing it unto the Lord, then we've got to take that into consideration. Why was Daniel so good and so faithful at his work? I believe it's because he did everything he did as if he were doing it for God Himself. And that's something we've got to look at. Now, there's another area that is even bigger than that, okay? We can be faithful at our job, and there's a lot of people who are great at their job. They're great at work. They're the hardest worker. They do all of this stuff. They excel in all this, but the rest of their life is completely in shambles, right? We all know people like that. They're very good at what they do, but their personal life is falling apart. So we've got to be faithful at work. And the second area is we've got to be faithful in life. You got to be faithful at work. You got to be faithful at life. Just the things you do. Let's look at how Daniel did this. Daniel chapter 6 verse 4, it says, Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. And again, it's one of those things where in your life, if those people who want to find a way to bring you down, are they going to find anything in the way you live your life, in the things you do? Are you faithful in life, or are you not? there's a lot, and in the past we've kind of had this mentality of you keep, your personal life completely separate from work. You just separate them. They're not related. They don't go together. You just keep them separate. And the fact of the matter is that doesn't work at all. And bosses understand that now. There's a lot of bosses in a lot of big companies that if you're one of the managers and you go and you have an affair, you will actually lose your job. You know why? Because if you're not faithful in your life, you're not going to be faithful with your work. Plain and simple. If your life is falling apart, if you're an alcoholic on every day that you're not working, guess what? It's going to eventually spill over into your work life. It will. You cannot keep them separate. It's going to spill over. The question is, are you going to be faithful in life? Are you going to be faithful in your marriage? Are you going to be faithful in those things that you do? Are you going to be faithful to your kids? Are you going to be faithful in everything you do, whether it's related to work or not? A lot of us get caught up in this idea of being faithful at work, not faithful at home. You've got to be faithful in both of them. Now, there's one last area. So, what we see happen is in the story, these guys are trying to find a way to get Daniel to fail, and they can't. So what they do is they actually go and appeal to the king and his pride. They go to the king and they say, "You, O King Darius, are so great and so wonderful. You are so mighty and wonderful. And we think that for 30 days, nobody should worship anybody but you. It should all be about you. And let's even take it a step further. And if anybody worships any other god other than you, because you're so great, so mighty and wonderful, if anybody worships anyone other than you in those 30 days, we should throw them in the lion's den and let them be eaten alive." And the king's like, "I kind of like the sound of that, Like, that sounds okay. I am so great, and so I am the king of one of the largest, kingdoms in the world. I mean, I deserve at least 30 days. And so he signs this. Now, in their way of culture and their laws and everything, a law that is enacted by the king cannot be revoked by anybody, including the king. The king can't even go back. So Darius does this, and the guys are like, "Great, we found, this is our loophole. This is how we're going to do." So Daniel finds out about it. And this is what we find. Daniel is faithful to God above all. Because when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So even though all of a sudden everything's being called into question, he's saying, "No, I am first and foremost going to be faithful to God." If you're not faithful to God, you're going to have a hard time being faithful at home, you're going to have a hard time being faithful in life, and you're going to have a hard time being faithful with work. Plain and simple. If you want to live a faithful life, you got to be faithful to God. And you've got to maintain that relationship with Him all of the time. And you've got to put that first. Now, Daniel does this. And he makes this kind of a commitment. And the thing is the guys find out about it, right? They're looking for something wrong with him, and they know they'll find it in his relationship with God. So they go and they watch him as he prays to his God, and then they go to the king and they say, "Oh, King Darius, Daniel doesn't care about you. Daniel doesn't think you're as great as we do. Daniel doesn't pay attention to your laws. Daniel doesn't do this, doesn't do that, because he's still worshiping his God." And here's the great thing, is the king then spends an entire day trying to figure out how to get Daniel out of this mess. Because Daniel was so faithful in everything, that he then wants to find a way to get Daniel out of this mess. So he spends all day, and then finally at the end, he orders that Daniel be brought because he doesn't have a choice, and he tells him, "Daniel, may your God save you." And they throw Daniel in the lion's den. And this is the classic part that we all know and love. because Daniel is in the lion's den, and these lions that are there for, they're in this den for that purpose only, right? They're there for the sole purpose of eating people, okay? And it's kind of brutal. And he's there, and Daniel gets thrown in, and God prevents the lions from eating him. And so the next day, Darius, the king of the most powerful kingdom in the world at the time, is like, he's worried about Daniel, and he's staying up all night, and he can't sleep, and he's fasting and asking God, would you please save Daniel, your servant? Would you do this? And he goes in the morning and finds that Daniel's still alive. So that's cool. And then the king has Daniel brought out, and then he tells the other guys who tried to get Daniel in trouble, he has them thrown in there instead, right? Talk about a plan backfiring in a bad way. Because now these guys get thrown into the lion's den, and this king of the most powerful nation who believed everybody should worship him turns around and starts worshiping the God of heaven. Think about that. This guy now, because Daniel has been so faithful to God, the king of the most powerful nation on earth at this time turns around and starts worshiping and praising God because of how powerful and mighty he is. So, what's the big deal in living a faithful life? Why should we strive to live a faithful life? Here's why. A faithful life will bring glory to God and favor with people. A faithful life will bring glory to God and favor with people. What does that mean? When you remain faithful all the time, you don't let circumstances change anything. You don't let anything change how you do your work. You don't let anything change how well you are in your life and how good you maintain your life. It doesn't matter what happens. You don't change your relationship with God. You don't do any of that. You don't bring anything down or lower your standards in any way. You remain faithful in every way. When you do that, people notice. People will notice, and they will follow God in a bigger way. They will glorify God because of you. And then on top of that, they will trust you more. Think about it. How many of you have ever known somebody who was not faithful in their job, not faithful at work, didn't really stand for anything, just kind of flip-flopped around? And how many of you, whenever they come to you and they tell you something, that you immediately take it with a big grain of salt because you sit there and go, I don't know that this person is being all that honest with me. But if you see somebody who they maintain this faithfulness no matter what, no matter what's going on, no matter who's around, no matter what, you turn around and you say, they are faithful, and I trust what they have to say. People will trust you in a bigger way if you live a faithful life. If you don't, then you will actually bring shame to God and dishonor on yourself. But if you